Dawn crept over the countryside like a reluctant promise, pale light sliding across frostbitten grass and the crooked roofs of a forgotten village. The air carried the sharp smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Along the narrow road that cut through the fields walked a young woman whose coat was too thin for the cold, and whose boots had been mended so many times they looked more patched than leather. Her name was, and at 22 years old she owned little more than the small suitcase swinging from her tired hand. The suitcase was scuffed and faded, its metal clasp loose from years of use. Inside were 3 dresses, a worn book of poems her mother once loved, and a silver locket containing the only photograph she had left of her parents. Everything else had been lost to time, illness, and the quiet cruelty of circumstance. People in the village watched her pass with the same expression they always wore, half pity, half dismissal. "There goes the poor girl again," one woman murmured while sweeping her doorstep. Another shook her head. "Pretty face but no dowry, beauty fades, poverty stays." Their words floated behind like cold breath in winter air, but she kept walking. She had learned long ago that responding to such whispers only made them louder. Her parents had died when she was 16, taken within the same bitter winter by a fever that swept through the valley like a silent thief. The neighbors helped bury them, then slowly returned to their own lives. Since then had lived wherever someone allowed her to stay, a corner of a farmhouse, a servant's cot near a kitchen hearth, sometimes the drafty attic of a shopkeeper who needed help cleaning. Work was never the problem, worked harder than most. She rose before sunrise, scrubbed floors until her hands cracked, cooked meals she often could not afford to eat herself. Yet every place she stayed eventually ended the same way. A polite smile, a careful pause, and the familiar words. "We simply can't keep you anymore." Sometimes it was because the family hired someone with connections, sometimes because a relative arrived who needed the room, sometimes there was no reason at all. A girl without family, money, or protection was easy to forget. Still carried something stubborn inside her heart, not pride exactly, something quieter, a belief that kindness mattered, even when no one noticed it. On the morning everything changed, she had just finished helping the baker knead dough when the postman pushed open the shop door. He shook snow from his coat and pulled several letters from his satchel. "Anything for me today?" the baker asked. "Only bills," the postman replied with a grin. Then he looked down at one final envelope. "And a one for Miss." Blinked in surprise, no one wrote to her. The envelope was thick cream paper, sealed with dark wax stamped by a crest she didn't recognize. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke it open. Inside was a single letter written in elegant black ink. It explained that Duke Alexander Blackwood, lord of the immense Blackwood estate beyond the hills, was seeking a wife through a formal arrangement. Women of suitable age could present themselves at the manor for consideration. Read the letter twice, certain she must have misunderstood. Why would such a message be sent to her? The baker peered over her shoulder and let out a low whistle. "Blackwood Manor," he said. "Now that's a strange business." Another worker leaned closer. "You don't know about the Duke." Shook her head. They exchanged glances before the baker lowered his voice. "Alexander Blackwood is rich beyond counting, but he's colder than the winter wind. Women come to meet him, hopping to become duchess." He shrugged. "Most leave before sunset, the rest leave in tears." Wine asked quietly. "No one knows," the worker replied. "Some say he doesn't trust women, others say his heart froze years ago." The baker folded his arms. "If I were you, girl, I'd forget that letter ever arrived." But did not forget. All that day she carried the folded paper in her pocket, feeling its presence like a question pressing gently against her thoughts. She had no money, no home waiting, no family who might someday arrange a match. Yet the letter had been sent to her. Not to a noblewoman, not to someone with jewels or a grand name. To her. That evening, as twilight turned the sky the color of fatting embers, packed her small suitcase. The baker watched from the doorway, worry creasing his face. "You're really going?" She nodded softly. "I know it sounds foolish," she admitted, "but if I stay here, nothing changes." The road to Blackwood Manor stretched far beyond the village, winding through forests and open fields where winter clung stubbornly to the earth. Walked most of the night, her breath forming pale clouds in the dark air. By morning, the manor finally appeared on the horizon. It rose from the hills like something carved from shadow, tall stone towers, iron gates, and windows that reflected the gray sky without warmth. Servants moved quietly across the courtyard as approached. Several stopped to stare at her modest clothes and worn suitcase. A maid stepped forward. "State your name." Or she said. The maid studied her for a long moment, then sighed softly. "You're here for the Duke, aren't you?" Nodded. The maid opened the gates with a heavy creak. "Then come inside," she said gently, "but don't expect kindness from the man who waits beyond those doors." Moments later stood inside a vast chamber where a single figure waited near the tall windows. Duke Alexander Blackwood turned slowly toward her, his dark eyes unreadable. And before she could even catch her breath, he asked the question that would change both their lives. "What," he said coldly, "do you bring to this marriage?" The question lingered in the vast chamber like a blade suspended in cold air. Felt the weight of the Duke's gaze as if it were pressing against her chest. Duke Alexander Blackwood stood near the tall windows, where winter light framed his tall figure in silver-gray shadow. Everything about him seemed carved from restraint: his dark coat, the rigid line of his shoulders, the controlled stillness of a man who allowed nothing to move him. Servants along the walls watched silently. Lowered her eyes for a moment, steadying the nervous flutter in her chest. She knew the answer he expected. Every girl who came here must have offered something: wealth, connections, beauty, ambition. But she had none of those things. "I have nothing to offer," she said softly. The Duke's expression did not change. Then she lifted her gaze and added in a quiet voice that trembled only slightly, "Only my love." A faint murmur rippled through the servants. Alexander did not react immediately. Instead, he studied her as one might study an unfamiliar language, curious, cautious, slightly skeptical. Her dress was plain, the color faded from years of washing. Her boots were worn thin at the toes. Nothing about her suggested ambition or clever schemes. Yet her voice had carried something steady, something honest. He turned away first. "You may stay for a few days," he said at last. "After that, I will decide whether you remain or leave." The words were neither kind nor cruel, simply distant. Bowed her head. "Thank you, Your Grace." She was shown to a modest guest room on the upper floor of the manor. The space was larger than any room she had ever slept in, yet it felt strangely empty. Heavy curtains blocked most of the daylight, and the fireplace burned low, as if the house itself had grown used to silence. For the first time since arriving, allowed herself to breathe deeply. The Duke had not rejected her, but he had not welcomed her either. In the days that followed, she discovered that Blackwood Manor functioned with quiet precision. Servants moved through long corridors like careful shadows. Meals were prepared with elegance, yet the great dining hall rarely echoed with conversation. The Duke kept to himself. Most mornings he rode across his vast lands, inspecting fields and forests with the detached focus of a man more comfortable with responsibility than with people. Quickly realized something else. No one laughed in this house. Not loudly, not freely. And so she did the only thing she knew how to do. She worked. When the cook struggled to lift a heavy pot, stepped forward to help. When a maid dropped a tray of silverware and began apologizing nervously, knelt beside her and gathered each piece with quiet reassurance. She asked for nothing in return. Within a week, the servants began speaking to her differently. "She's not like the others," one whispered in the kitchen. "Most women arrive demanding gowns and jewels," another replied. She asked where the broom was kept. The change did not go unnoticed. One evening, while walking through the stable yard, Duke Alexander paused near the open barn door. Inside, knelt beside a stable boy whose hand had been scraped badly by a broken fence post. She held the boy's wrist gently while wrapping a strip of clean cloth around the wound. "There," she said warmly, "it will sting for a moment, but it will heal." The boy nodded gratefully. Alexander watched from the shadows without announcing himself. There was no performance in her kindness, no attempt to impress. She simply cared. Days later he saw her again, this time in the library. The room was dim except for a single candle near the window. Sat curled in a chair with a book resting on her lap, her expression thoughtful as she read. Alexander stepped inside quietly. "That book," he said suddenly, "is not meant for entertainment." looked up, startled. "I'm sorry, Your Grace," she said quickly. "I didn't know it was forbidden." "It isn't forbidden," he replied, "only difficult." She glanced down at the page. "It is," she admitted, "but the words are beautiful." He studied her again, puzzled by the calm sincerity in her voice. "Why stay here?" he asked. "You could leave tomorrow." Close the book gently. "Because this is the first place where I wasn't asked to leave immediately." The answer lingered between them. Something inside Alexander shifted slightly, though he could not name the feeling. That night they shared dinner across the length of the enormous table. Candlelight flickered across polished silver and crystal glasses, but the space between them felt larger than the room itself. After several silent minutes, the Duke finally spoke. "If you married me," he said, "you would gain wealth, security, and status beyond anything you have known." His tone carried the cool logic of a contract. Set down her fork. "I know." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "So I will ask again," he said, "what do you truly want from this arrangement?" Hesitated only briefly. Then she answered with quiet honesty. "I want a place where I'm not unwanted." For the first time in years, the Duke had no reply. The words struck somewhere deeper than he expected, brushing against memories he had carefully locked away. Because once, long ago, he had believed in love too. Before betrayal had taught him how easily affection could be traded for wealth and ambition. Alexander rose abruptly from the table. "Finish your dinner," he said stiffly. He walked away without looking back. But that night, long after the manor had fallen asleep, Duke Alexander Blackwood stood alone by his window, staring across the dark fields. And for reasons he could not understand, the quiet presence of the girl who claimed to have nothing had begun to disturb the carefully frozen peace of his heart. Spring began creeping into the valley, melting the last stubborn traces of snow around Blackwood Manor. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, warming the stone corridors that had long been accustomed to silence. Yet within those walls, something had begun to change, something subtle but impossible to ignore. The servants noticed it first. The Duke lingered longer in the gardens. His footsteps paused outside the library doors more often than before, and when entered a room, the tension that usually surrounded him softened by a fraction, as though a quiet warmth had slipped into the air. Herself remained unaware of the quiet storm she was stirring inside him. She moved through the manor with the same gentle humility she had always carried, helping wherever she could, speaking kindly to those who rarely heard kindness directed toward them. One afternoon she knelt beside a patch of newly planted roses in the garden, brushing soil from her fingers, when she sensed someone standing behind her. Alexander. He had approached silently, as he often did. "You planted those?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, glancing at the fragile green shoots. "The gardener said the soil here was too cold for them, but I thought perhaps they only needed patience." Alexander studied the small plants pushing their way toward the sunlight. "Roses are stubborn," he said quietly. Smiled faintly. "So am I." The simple exchange lingered in his thoughts long after he walked away. For the first time since the day she arrived, he found himself imagining a future where her presence in the manor was not temporary. But change rarely goes unnoticed. And not everyone welcomed it. Lady Victoria arrived at Blackwood Manor on a bright afternoon that smelled faintly of rain. Her carriage rolled across the courtyard with the smooth confidence of someone who believed she belonged there. Tall, elegant, and dressed in deep crimson silk, Victoria carried herself with the polished certainty of a woman accustomed to admiration. Years earlier, she had expected to marry Alexander Blackwood. Their families had quietly encouraged the match. Wealth would combine with wealth, power with power. But Alexander had withdrawn from society after a scandal that no one spoke of openly. Victoria had never forgiven the humiliation. Now, stepping into the manor's grand hall, she quickly sensed something different in the air. Servants moved with lighter steps. And when she heard his name whispered among them, curiosity sharpened into something colder. "Who is this girl?" Victoria asked one maid later that evening. "A guest, my lady," the maid answered carefully. Victoria's lips curved into a thin smile. Guests did not change the atmosphere of a house. Rivals did. Over the next several days, she observed quietly. She noticed how Alexander's eyes followed during dinner, even when he pretended not to look. She noticed how his voice lost its usual sharpness when speaking to her. The realization settled like poison in Victoria's thoughts. A poor orphan. A girl with no title. Taking what should have been hers. Victoria refused to accept it. If Alexander had grown soft toward this girl, then she would remind him exactly why he had once sworn never to trust a woman's affection. The plan came together quickly. One evening, Victoria wrote a letter in careful handwriting, imitating the rough script of a village man. The words suggested a secret understanding between and someone waiting outside the manor. Someone expecting payment. Someone who believed the girl was merely waiting for the right moment to secure the Duke's fortune. When the ink dried, Victoria sealed the letter and arranged for it to reach Alexander's desk the following morning. The trap was simple, but devastating. Alexander read the letter alone in his study. The words blurred for a moment as anger stirred like a storm he thought long buried. It was exactly the kind of deception he had feared from the beginning. Exactly the kind of betrayal he had once suffered. His jaw tightened. Perhaps he had been a fool to believe was different. That evening he summoned her to the study. Entered quietly, her hands clasped together in front of her. She immediately sensed the shift in the room. Alexander stood near the fireplace, his posture rigid. "Your Grace," she said softly. He held up the letter. "Do you recognize this?" Frowned as she took the paper. Her confusion was genuine. "No," she said slowly, "I've never seen it." Alexander's eyes hardened. "It claims you have someone waiting for you in the village," he said coldly. "Someone expecting a share of whatever fortune you might secure here." Shock drained the color from her face. "That's not true." "You expect me to believe that?" he asked sharply. Shook her head desperately. "I came here alone. I told you that from the beginning." But Alexander's voice had already retreated behind the same icy walls he had spent years building. "Every woman who has ever approached me claimed honesty," he said bitterly. "And every one of them wanted something." Tears shimmered in his eyes. "I didn't lie to you." The quiet certainty in her voice should have mattered. But old wounds have a way of drowning out truth. Alexander turned away from her. "I believe this arrangement has lasted long enough." The words fell like stones. For several seconds, simply stood there, absorbing the meaning. Then she placed the letter gently on the desk. "I told you the truth the first day we met," she whispered. Alexander did not respond. His silence felt colder than anger. That night packed the same small suitcase she had carried into the manor weeks before. The room that had briefly felt like shelter now seemed as temporary as every place she had ever stayed. Before leaving, she wrote a single note and placed it on the table. The corridors were quiet as she walked toward the front doors. Outside, the night air carried the scent of approaching rain. By morning, she was gone. When Alexander entered the dining hall later that day, the servants moved carefully around him, their expressions subdued. Something felt wrong. The house seemed quieter than usual. The maid who often served breakfast hesitated before speaking. "Your Grace," she said gently. "Miss has left the manor." Alexander stared at her. Then his gaze drifted toward the empty chair where it had once sat, and for the first time since reading the letter, an uneasy thought crept slowly into his mind. What if he had just sent away the only honest heart that had ever stood before him? The manor had grown colder in his absence. Winter's last frost melted into a reluctant spring, yet inside Blackwood Manor the chill lingered, curling around stone corridors and echoing through empty halls. Alexander moved through his rooms with a hollow precision, performing the duties of a duke while his heart carried the weight of regret. The forged letter, Victoria's treachery, had been exposed by the head maid, who arrived breathless one morning, clutching evidence that proved innocence. Alexander held the papers in trembling hands, the words staring back at him like a mirror of his own folly. Anger and shame collided in a storm he could not quiet. He had doubted the girl who claimed to have nothing but love, had allowed the poison of rumor to blind him, and now the consequences pressed against him with a force that left him breathless. He rode through the village at dawn, his black coat whipping against the morning wind, searching every familiar road, every quiet lane, every inn that might have offered her shelter. He asked villagers in hushed tones, describing the girl with eyes like clear water and a heart so open it had penetrated his defenses in ways he would never admit aloud. Each answer brought only frustration. Each trail ended in empty fields or shuttered doors. Weeks became months. The snow gave way to muddy paths. The muddy paths gave way to green shoots along the roadside, yet still she remained beyond his grasp. The man who had once believed himself immune to hope began to understand what longing truly felt like. He realized that his carefully constructed walls, the armor of a heart long betrayed, had been pierced by something he had never expected: genuine, unwavering love. Nights he spent staring at the empty chair in the dining hall turned into sleepless hours, replaying every small gesture, every quiet smile, every moment in which she had shown kindness without expectation. It was in late afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the clouds in streaks of gold and gray, that a distant sound carried to him, the faint melody of a voice singing softly through the village chapel, a voice he would never forget. Alexander's horse broke into a sudden gallop, hooves pounding over the stones, heart leaping with a mix of fear and hope. Could it truly be her, after all this time? He reached the small chapel at the edge of the village, a modest building surrounded by wildflowers that had begun to bloom despite the lingering chill. And there she was, kneeling on the stone floor, her hands busy arranging baskets of food and clothing for the villagers she had come to help. Time had tempered her youth, left a delicate line around her eyes, but her presence radiated the same warmth that had captivated him from the beginning. She looked up suddenly, sensing the approach of someone not part of the quiet crowd she aided. Her breath caught, and the baskets remained untouched at her side. The world seemed to narrow to the space between her and him. Recognition sparked, bright and overwhelming. "Alexander," she whispered, voice trembling, unsure whether it was relief or fear that drove the sound. He dismounted without ceremony, boots hitting the stone floor with quiet authority. For a moment, neither of them moved. He took in her presence, the simplicity of her dress, the earnestness of her hands, the way her eyes reflected light like unspoiled water. And he realized how foolish he had been, how nearly he had lost the only heart capable of offering him truth. "Knew I'd find you here," he said finally, his voice low, rough with emotion he had long. "I searched everywhere. He paused, swallowing hard. "I was a fool to doubt you." His lips parted, and for a heartbeat she could not speak. She had waited, watched the seasons shift, held her love in silent hope, never certain if he would ever come. "Alexander," she murmured, stepping closer, her hands slightly shaking. "You believed a lie, you," she stopped, the words faltering as her chest tightened. "I thought you'd never come." He reached for her hands, the gesture simple yet monumental. Fingers intertwined, warmth meeting warmth for the first time in months. The crowd in the chapel seemed to fade into shadows, leaving only the two of them in a fragile, precious bubble of clarity. "You gave me something I didn't understand at first," he said, voice rough and low. "Love, true, honest love, and I was too blind, too arrogant, too afraid to see it." Tears glistened in her eyes, catching the light from the stained glass windows. "It doesn't matter now," she whispered. "What matters is here now. You found me." For the first time, Alexander allowed himself to kneel, not as a duke, but as a man stripped bare by longing. "Forgive me. I cannot undo my mistake, but I can offer this, my life, my heart, everything I have left to give, only if you will accept it." A trembling smile curved her lips, and she leaned into his embrace. The village chapel, the baskets of food, the soft hum of life around them, all faded as they held each other. The weight of months apart, the ache of doubt and betrayal, melted like frost under sunlight. They remained entwined for long moments, neither speaking, letting the enormity of reunion settle over them like a balm. Alexander rested his forehead against hers, inhaling the scent of her hair, the subtle fragrance of lavender and earth, a reminder of everything he had nearly lost. "I thought I had nothing to offer," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "but love is everything." He pressed a hand to her cheek, a tender affirmation of the truth she had spoken months before. "And you've given me more than I could have imagined," he replied. "Everything I thought I wanted, it pales before this, before you." The villagers around them kept a respectful distance, their eyes softened with understanding, sensing the depth of what had transpired without needing to speak. The small chapel became a sanctuary not just of stone and wood, but of hearts reunited, of forgiveness, and of a love that had refused to die despite betrayal, distance, and doubt. As they walked from the chapel together, hand in hand, the spring sunlight poured over the hills, gilding the path ahead. No grand announcement awaited them, no pomp or ceremony, just the quiet certainty that they had survived the cold, the lies, and the months apart. Their journey was only beginning, but the foundation had been laid, trust renewed, hearts exposed, love reclaimed. Alexander paused at the edge of the village, glancing at, with a vulnerability no title could grant him. "Promise me something," he said softly. "Anything," she replied. "Never let me doubt love again," he whispered. His hand squeezed his. "I never stopped," she said, her voice steady now, radiant with the strength of everything endured. And for the first time in his life, the Duke allowed himself to hope without fear. The love that had refused to die had returned, blazing brighter than the coldest winter, and nothing, neither treachery nor distance, could ever take it from them again. The horizon stretched before them, golden and infinite, and Alexander stepped forward together, hearts entwined, leaving the shadows of doubt and regret far behind.